Hi, I'm Stuart from the Norfolk Honey Company and welcome back to my Getting Started in Beekeeping series of videos for 2017. Today we're back in the honey room where last week we extracted the honey from the beehive on our allotment apiary, and today we're going to get that honey into our settling tank through some strainers, and hopefully later in the day we'll also get it into some jars and show you the finished product from our first season with our allotment beehive. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do consider hitting that subscribe button in the bottom corner of the screen there. If you do click on it, there'll be a little bell symbol, and if you click on that, you'll get notification each time we upload a new video. We've a growing back catalogue of videos to share with you, including our Maze Moth Apiaries videos and also our Beekeeping Basics videos. So over this summer we've produced 3 videos a week, and I hope that you're all enjoying them, and hopefully they're helping with some of the techniques that you're using in producing healthier and stronger honeybee colonies, and hopefully you're enjoying a honey crop similar to that which we've enjoyed from our allotment beehive this year. So what I'll do is I'll just show you the equipment that we've got set up ready to go. It's fairly basic equipment, and I like to jar all of my honey using small batches rather than putting it into a very large settling tank. We use a smaller tank, and then we'll get the honey and pour it through the strainer and into the settling tank, and we'll give that a few hours just to settle out, and then we'll come back and jar it up perhaps later this afternoon. So let's spin around and take a look at the equipment we've got. I'll take the camera off the tripod and give you a guided tour. So this is our settling tank and filter system, and I'll just pull this apart and just show you what we've got. So in the bottom we've got our settling tank itself, and that's on a tripod base. Beneath it we've got our scales. Really important that you have scales that can accurately measure the honey that you're putting into your jars. And then on top of our settling tank we've got our double strainer, and this has a double straining system. So we've got the coarse strainer here, and then we've got our cloth strainer inside, and so the honey is going to go through the 2 strainers and then down into the settling tank. If you've got a settling tank, always remember to close off the tap and secure it first, because you don't want to be pouring your honey down and through and have it all running out over your worktop. And so these are fairly standard stainless steel settling tanks. I would always recommend that you go for a stainless steel tank. You can get food grade plastics which work just as well, but I prefer the stainless steel because it allows me to get it nice and clean, and you don't get any staining on the side of the stainless steel as sometimes you do with plastic equipment. I think I got these tanks, the 25 kilo tank and the filter system, at one of the UK trade shows, and they're on offer, so it's always worth popping along to the trade shows and seeing exactly what's on offer and pick yourself up a bargain. The scales themselves come from a UK based company that were an online company, and you can use this to zero in the weights when you've got an empty jar on, and then it will show the net weight that you've got when you run your honey through into your jar. Okay, so let's go and get the bucket of honey and put it through the strainer and get it into the settling tank. Another very invaluable item that I have is this piece of stainless steel. It's actually a bucket support, so this goes on top of the strainer and the bucket sits on it and allows every last drop of honey to run out of the bucket, so it saves you having to balance it on the top. Too many times in the past I've tried to balance a bucket and it's fallen over. So this is a worthy investment. If you can find one of these at one of the trade shows again, then it's well worth picking up, and it allows you to then be hands-free and sort other things out while the honey's running through the strainer. And it's very simple. It just clips onto the side of the strainer at the top and just sits there, and when you tip the bucket over you can just rest the bucket on top of that, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. Okay, so let's get the honey. So I've got the bucket of honey here. I've taken the lid off. This is our bucket of honey from the allotment, and when you pour it into the strainer you want to make sure that you pour it in a smooth but quick motion and don't stop once you start pouring it. So once I start pouring it, I'm going to continue pouring it, and then I'll pop the bucket onto the support stand that I've got here. So there's our hard work from the allotment, and then that can rest on the stand, and now I'm hands-free and I can get on with another job. So I'll just grab the camera and show you that. So the honey will now fall through the coarse strainer on the top, settle onto the fine strainer beneath it, and then it will gradually run through the fine strainer and into the settling tank below. Now, in an ideal world we'd have the honey slightly warmer than it is. It's been sat in the garage for approximately a week now, but unfortunately we couldn't do anything with it at the time. But what I would normally do is extract the honey, and then once I've got it into the buckets, it would then go straight into the strainer, through the strainer into the settling tank, and then we could jar it up within 24 hours or so of it having been extracted. And that makes for a much easier life, because the honey will be less viscous, it will flow easier, and it will go through the double strainer that much quicker. So all we can do now is to wait, and we'll come back in a couple of hours time and just check up on this and see whether or not it's all gone through into the settling tank and is starting to settle. And the reason we leave it in the settling tank is to allow for all the very tiny bubbles to drift to the surface, so that when we jar the honey we don't fill the jar with lots of unwanted bubbles, and that will result in a kind of bubble scum that sits on top of the honey, which doesn't look terribly pleasant when somebody takes the lid off and they're confronted with this white mass of bubbles that sits on top of the honey. So we try to remove all of those bubbles first, and then when we do jar it up, there are very few, if any, bubbles that sit on top of the honey, and when you take the lid off, all you've got is that golden honey looking back at you, ready to be eaten. So we'll pause there and we'll come back in a couple of hours' time. So it's been about 3 hours now since I tipped the bucket into the strainers, and that's now gone through the strainers and into the settling tank. So I'll just take this apart and show you how it filters the honey and what it consists of. So the bucket is now completely empty of honey, and that's nicely drained. So any last large particles that would have been in the honey will have been caught in this. You might recall that we actually strained it when we extracted it, so there won't be too much in this top strainer. But then in the bottom of the two strainers we'll have the smaller particles, and I can remove this nylon strainer and that will have caught some of the smaller particles in the bottom of the strainer there. So we'll move those out of the way. We can remove the support, and then I have a lid that fits on top of the strainer to prevent any further dust or particles from going into it. But before I do that, we'll just take a look at the honey that's in the settling tank. and you can see all of the small bubbles that have now risen to the surface, and that's why we put it into the settling tank, to avoid those bubbles from going into the jars of honey. And all that remains now is for us to undo the retaining wing nut and then release the honey down into the clean jar, and then once we've drawn off the correct weight, we just tighten the wing nut up again, and you can just wipe the residual honey away with the jar. So that's our first jar of honey, and you can probably see that there's still lots of bubbles in it, and that's because it needs to sit in the settling tank for several hours longer. If you decant it too early, then you will get bubbles sitting in the honey, and it needs to just sit in the settling tank for several more hours to allow those bubbles to rise to the surface. If it's still quite warm from extracting, then the bubbles will rise quite quickly, but because this has sat around for some time before we've actually put it into the settling tank, it's, as I said earlier, quite viscous, and the bubbles will take some time to rise to the surface. I would normally leave the honey in the settling tank for a little bit longer, but I wanted to get the video complete and get it published today, and so you can probably see that we've still got quite a lot of bubbles in the honey. So that's our first crop of honey from our allotment beehive, removed from the hive, extracted, strained, and now in the settling tank and into some jars, ready to go on the shelf and either be sold or for our use at home. We'll have a few more videos in this series for this year, just to finally settle the bees down for the winter. We'll get them fed and nicely prepared for going through this coming winter, and then hopefully out the other side and into spring. Next week we'll be back at the allotment to take a look at the bees, to see how they're getting on, to see whether the brood nest has started to slow down and contract a little bit, and whether they've got enough stores to see them through to the winter and out the other side into spring. And then if we need to feed them, we can feed them in the coming weeks. So I hope you'll join me for that, but until then, thanks for watching.